I think I'm falling for you, Lena whispered to Connor Walsh. But before he could answer, his 16-year-old son Evan said something that changed everything. Lena Hayes was wiping down the counter at the bookstore cafe section on a Wednesday evening in Albuquerque, watching the clock tick closer to closing time, and the only customers left were the regulars who treated the place like a second living room, including Connor Walsh, who'd claimed the corner table by the window for the past 2 hours, grading what looked like an endless stack of history essays. Connor had become part of the furniture over the past 9 months, showing up 3 or 4 times a week with his beaten-up leather messenger bag and a travel mug he'd refill at least twice. And somewhere between their conversations about whatever book he was reading and her recommendations for new releases, Lena had gone from looking forward to his visits to actively arranging her schedule so she'd be working when he usually came in. Tonight, his 16-year-old son Evan was with him, sprawled in the chair across from his dad with earbuds in and a calculus textbook open, doing that thing teenagers do where they're technically doing homework, but also scrolling their phone every 30 seconds. Lena grabbed the coffee pot and walked over to their table. You guys want refills before I shut down the machine? I'm closing in about 20 minutes, but you can stay as long as you need, Connor. I know you've still got like half a forest worth of papers to grade. Connor looked up and did that thing with his face that Evan had apparently noticed. The smile that was different from his polite stranger smile or his tired teacher smile. The one that reached all the way to his eyes and made the corners crinkle in a way that Lena had maybe spent too much time thinking about. You're a lifesaver. Yeah, I'll take another cup. I've got maybe 10 more of these to get through. And if I read one more essay that starts with throughout history, I might lose my mind. And Lena laughed while pouring coffee into his mug that had a faded logo from some teaching conference he'd been to years ago. She was about to ask Evan if he wanted anything when the kid pulled out one earbud and looked up from his calculus with the kind of casual observation that only teenagers can deliver, completely unaware they're about to detonate a bomb in the middle of a quiet bookstore. Dad, you smile differently when you talk to her. Evan said it like he was commenting on the weather, went right back to his homework like he hadn't just said the thing that both adults had been carefully not acknowledging for months. The effect was immediate and absolutely mortifying. Connor's pen stopped moving mid-word on whatever essay he'd been marking. Just froze completely like someone had hit pause on him, and Lena felt her face go hot enough that she was pretty sure she was visibly glowing red under the warm bookstore lighting. Connor fumbled the stack of papers he'd been holding, and two of them slid off the table onto the floor. And when he bent to pick them up, Lena saw the back of his neck had gone pink, which meant he was just as embarrassed as she was. And neither of them could make eye contact for a solid 3 seconds that felt more like 3 years. The silence was thick and awkward in a way that made Lena want to disappear into the poetry section and never come out. And she was trying to figure out if she should laugh it off or pretend she hadn't heard or just spontaneously combust. When Evan looked up again with the kind of follow-up that made it infinitely worse. It's a good smile, though, he added, like that somehow helped the situation. And then he stood up and announced he was going to go look at the graphic novel section in the back. Grabbed his phone and walked away, leaving his dad and Lena standing there in the wreckage of what had been a perfectly normal evening. Lena set the coffee pot down on their table because her hands were shaking slightly and she didn't trust herself to carry it back to the counter without spilling everywhere. And Connor was staring at the essays in front of him like they contained the secrets of the universe, clearly trying to figure out what to say or if he should say anything at all. The bookstore felt too quiet suddenly, even with the indie folk music playing softly through the speakers. And Lena knew she had two choices. She could make some excuse about needing to prep the register for closing and run away, or she could sit down and have the conversation that had been building between them for months. She pulled out the chair Evan had vacated and sat down across from Connor, and her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. So that was sufficiently mortifying, Lena said it, trying to keep her voice light, but it came out shaky, and Connor let out a laugh that sounded more like a release of tension than actual humor. My son has absolutely zero filter. I apologize for him essentially calling me out in the middle of your workplace. That's a new level of teenage boldness even for Evan. They both laughed nervously, and Lena was very aware that they were still dancing around what Evan had actually said. And she made a decision that was either brave or incredibly stupid, but she was already committed before her brain could talk her out of it. Connor, I need to tell you something, and I'm probably gonna regret saying this out loud, but if I don't say it now, I'm never gonna have the guts again. Lena's voice came out slightly unsteady, and she could feel her hands trembling in her lap under the table. Connor set down his red grading pen and gave her his full attention in a way that made her stomach flip, and she took a breath and let the words spill out before she could stop them. I think I'm falling for you. It came out quieter than she meant, almost a whisper, and the second the words were in the air between them, Lena wanted to grab them back and shove them down her throat. Because what if she'd read this entire thing wrong? What if his smile meant nothing and she just made their friendship completely weird? She immediately started pulling back both physically and verbally, her body language shifting to protective mode, looking down at the table instead of at him. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Forget I said anything. We can just pretend this conversation never happened and go back to normal. And she was already starting to stand up when Connor reached across the table and caught her hand, and the touch made her freeze completely. She looked at him and his face was doing something complicated. Not shocked exactly, but not entirely calm either. And for what felt like forever, he didn't say anything at all, just looked at her and then looked away toward the window, where the Albuquerque evening was settling into dark purple. Lena watched him breathe in like he was about to speak, and then he didn't. Just sat there holding her hand across the table, covered in student essays about the American Revolution. And the silence stretched out for 2, 3, 4 seconds that felt like they contained entire conversations. She was about to pull her hand back and actually leave this time when Connor looked at her again and said her name so quietly she almost didn't hear it over the music. Lena, just that, just her name. And then a pause that made her heart stop. And then finally, don't take it back. His voice was rough when he said it, like the words had been stuck in his throat for a while. And Lena felt something shift in her chest, the panic giving way to something that felt dangerously close to hope. Connor was still holding her hand, and his thumb brushed across her knuckles in a way that was definitely not accidental. I've been falling for you for months, since probably the third or fourth time I came in here. And you recommended that book about the history of maps, and then we talked about it for an hour. I've been looking for excuses to come here as often as possible without seeming like a stalker. Lena let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, because she'd been doing the exact same thing, rearranging her shifts and finding reasons to be at the front counter when she knew he usually showed up. But even as Connor said it, even as he held her hand and confirmed that this thing between them was mutual, his expression shifted to something that looked conflicted and almost pained. And Lena felt her stomach drop because she recognized that look. That was the look of someone about to deliver bad news. Before this goes any further, though, before we do this, there's something you need to know about me. Connor's voice had changed, gotten more serious, and he looked down at their joined hands like he was trying to find courage there. Something that might change everything, and I need you to hear it before you decide if you still want this. Lena's mind immediately went to the worst possible scenarios. He was sick, he was moving. He was still in love with his ex-wife. He'd committed some crime. But she squeezed his hand and said, okay, whatever it is, just tell me. You're kind of scaring me right now. Connor took another breath and looked at her, with eyes that were filled with something that looked a lot like shame and fear mixed together, and Lena braced herself for whatever was about to come out of his mouth. The bookstore felt like it was holding its breath. The music had switched to something instrumental and quiet, and somewhere in the back section, Evan was probably completely oblivious to the fact that his dad's entire life was about to either change direction or fall apart depending on what happened in the next few minutes. Connor Walsh let go of Lena's hand and stood up from the table so abruptly his chair scraped loud against the bookstore floor, and Lena watched him start pacing in the small space between their table and the philosophy section, like he physically couldn't sit still while trying to figure out how to say whatever was eating him alive. His hands went into his pockets and then came back out, and he ran one through his hair in that gesture people do when they're stressed beyond their ability to hide it, and Lena sat there feeling her heart pound because she'd never seen him like this. All the easy confidence he usually carried, completely stripped away, leaving just raw anxiety. Connor, you're kind of freaking me out. Whatever it is, just say it. I promise it's not going to be as bad as what I'm imagining right now. She said it, trying to sound calmer than she felt, and Connor stopped pacing long enough to look at her with an expression that was equal parts terrified and resigned. I'm not who you think I am. Connor's voice came out quiet and strained, and Lena felt ice water dump into her stomach because that sentence could mean about 1,000 different terrible things. He started pacing again, 3 steps toward the window. Turn, 3 steps back, and the words seemed to be fighting their way out of his throat like he'd been holding them in for so long they'd gotten stuck. You see me come in here with books and essays, probably think I've got my life together, stable job, good relationship with my kid, everything under control. But that's not the whole picture. And if we're going to do this, if you're actually falling for me, you need to know the truth about what you'd be signing up for. Lena wanted to tell him to just spit it out, but she could see he was struggling hard enough without her pushing. So she waited while he paced and collected whatever courage he needed to say the thing that was clearly destroying him. Finally, Connor stopped moving and leaned against the bookshelf with his back to her, and his voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. When my ex-wife left 5 years ago, when she walked out on me and Evan, she didn't just leave emotionally, she cleaned out our savings account, every dollar we had, took it all, and disappeared to California to start her new life. Lena's breath caught because she'd known his wife had left, but she hadn't known the details, hadn't known it had been that brutal, and Connor kept talking like now that he'd started, he couldn't stop. I was so focused on making sure Evan was okay, on keeping his life stable so he wouldn't fall apart from his mom abandoning him, that I didn't pay attention to how fast I was going into debt trying to maintain everything. Connor turned around to face her, and his eyes were red like he was fighting tears. Credit cards to cover groceries when the checking account was empty, personal loans to keep up with the mortgage, medical bills from when Evan broke his arm skateboarding and our insurance had that high deductible. It just kept piling up, and I kept telling myself I'd handle it, I'd pay it off, but I never could catch up. He laughed, but it came out bitter and broken. I'm $40,000 in debt, Lena. I work a second job tutoring online after Evan goes to bed just to make minimum payments. I lie awake at night doing math in my head, trying to figure out how to keep the lights on and buy groceries and not let my kid know we're barely scraping by. Lena sat there processing everything he was saying, and she could see the shame radiating off him in waves, the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes, the defensive hunch of his shoulders like he was bracing for her to get up and leave. Connor gestured vaguely toward nothing. You want to know what my evenings really look like? After I leave here, I go home and make dinner and help Evan with homework and try to be present for him. And then after he's asleep, I open my laptop and tutor kids on the other side of the country for $25 an hour. And the screen glow is the only light in the house because I'm trying to keep the electric bill down. And there's always cold coffee sitting next to me from hours ago that I forgot to drink. His voice was getting rougher. And my kitchen counter is covered in bills. Half of them I can't even bring myself to open because I already know I can't pay them. And my phone is constantly buzzing with notifications from creditors that I just ignore. Because what am I supposed to tell them? That I'm doing my best and it's still not enough? He was spiraling now, and Lena could see it. All the fear and shame he'd been carrying alone for years just pouring out in this bookstore after closing time. I can't take you on nice dates. I can't afford to go to restaurants or movies or do any of the normal things couples do. I'll probably never be able to buy you anything more expensive than a paperback book. And what kind of future is that? Connor's hands were shaking and his voice cracked on the last words. I'm telling you this now because I can't let you fall for some version of me that doesn't exist. I need you to know that if you choose this, you're choosing someone who's financially a complete disaster, someone who's one emergency away from everything falling apart, and I'll understand completely if that changes how you feel. The silence after he stopped talking was heavy and painful, and Lena watched him standing there in front of the philosophy section, looking like he'd just confessed to murder instead of just being a normal person, struggling with debt like millions of other Americans. She stood up slowly and walked over to where he was leaning against the bookshelf, and she said something she'd been thinking since he started talking, but wasn't sure if she should say out loud. Is that what you think makes you unlovable? Her voice came out soft, but the question hit him like she'd physically pushed him, and Connor's face did something complicated. a laugh that was more defense mechanism than humor. And then the laugh died in his throat, and his face crumpled, and his voice cracked completely when he tried to answer. My wife left Lena. She looked at our life and our struggles and decided it wasn't worth sticking around for. And yeah, a big part of that was money, was me not being able to provide the life she thought she deserved. Connor's voice was wrecked now. The transition from trying to maintain control to full vulnerability happening in real time. And I've spent 5 years convinced that I'm not enough, that any woman who really knows what my life looks like is eventually going to realize she can do better. And I cannot go through that again. I cannot let Evan get attached to someone who's going to leave when things get hard. Tears were running down his face now, and he didn't even bother wiping them away. So, yeah, I guess I do think that being broke and drowning in debt makes me unlovable, or at least not worth the hassle. Lena felt her own tears starting because watching someone you care about believe they're worthless is its own special kind of pain. And she reached up and put her hands on either side of Connor's face, making him look at her. You want to know something? I make $32,000 a year working at this bookstore. I have $18,000 in student loans from a degree I'm not even using. I live in a studio apartment that has one kitchen cabinet that won't close properly. And I've been eating ramen and peanut butter sandwiches for dinner more nights than I want to admit, because that's what I can afford after rent and loan payments. Connor was staring at her like he'd never considered she might have her own financial struggles, and Lena kept going. You think you're the only one who's not living some perfect financially stable life? Connor, we're in our 30s. Most people our age are in debt, or struggling, or trying to figure out how to adult on salaries that don't match the cost of living. You're not broken. You're just human. She let go of his face and took his hand instead, pulled him back toward the table so they could sit down because this conversation was too important to have while standing. Your ex-wife left because she wasn't strong enough to weather hard times with you. That's on her character, not on your worth. And the fact that you've kept Evan's life stable and kept working multiple jobs and kept fighting instead of giving up. That's the opposite of being not enough. That's you being everything. Connor was listening, but she could see the doubt still written all over his face. The years of shame and feeling like a failure, not just disappearing because she said some nice words. And Lena knew this was the moment that would determine if they actually had a shot at this or if his fear was going to win. I'm not going to lie to you and say money doesn't matter or that struggling financially doesn't suck, because it does. But Connor, I fell for you watching you grade papers and recommend books to strangers and talk about your son like he's the best thing that ever happened to you. I fell for who you are, not what you have. Lena's voice was steady now. And if you think I'm going to run away because you have debt and work 2 jobs, then you don't know me very well. I'm not looking for someone to rescue me financially. I'm looking for someone who's real and honest and trying their best, and that's you. They sat there at that table with his half-graded essays and her coffee pot, and the weight of everything that had just been said hanging between them. And finally, Connor spoke again, quieter this time. What if it doesn't get better? What if I'm still paying off this debt in 5 years, in 10 years? What if we can never afford to go on vacation or buy a house or do any of the things normal couples do? His voice was raw with fear, and Lena squeezed his hand. Then we figure it out together. We make cheap meals at home and go on walks in the park and build a life out of what we can afford. And maybe that's not the fantasy, but it can still be good. Connor looked at her for a long time, really looked, and she could see him trying to decide if he could trust this, if he could let himself believe that maybe he was worth choosing, despite everything. I'm terrified, Connor admitted. I'm terrified of letting you in and having you realize this is too hard. I'm terrified of Evan getting attached to you and then losing you. I'm terrified that I'm going to mess this up because I don't know how to let someone help carry this weight I've been hauling alone for years. Lena felt tears on her own face now. I'm terrified too. I'm terrified of falling for you and having your shame push me away. But Connor, I want to try this. I want to try us. And I need you to be brave enough to let me stay even when you're convinced I should go. They sat there in the quiet bookstore, holding hands across a table covered in American Revolution essays, while Evan browsed graphic novels, completely unaware that his dad's entire life had just shifted, and finally Connor nodded. Just a small movement, but it meant everything. and they both knew that whatever came next, they were choosing to face it together instead of alone. The first few months of dating Connor Walsh felt like Lena was learning a completely new language. The language of loving someone who'd been convinced they weren't worth loving, and it showed up in the smallest ways that broke her heart and made her more determined at the same time. Their dates were walks around the university campus because they were free, cooking dinner at her studio apartment because eating out was a luxury neither could afford, is sitting in the bookstore after her shifts talking about everything and nothing while Evan did homework at a nearby table. Connor would sometimes reach for his wallet to pay for something and then remember he couldn't, and she'd watch shame flash across his face before he covered it with a joke or a subject change. And every single time Lena wanted to shake him and tell him she didn't care. But she was learning that shame doesn't disappear just because someone tells you it's okay. Evan had taken to Lena immediately in that way teenagers do when they've been waiting for their parent to be happy again. And one Saturday when they were all at the bookstore, Evan had looked up from his graphic novel and said completely unprompted, "I like that Dad laughs more now. He used to just kind of exist, you know?" Lena had glanced at Connor, who'd gone slightly pink and was very focused on his coffee, and she'd felt something warm settle in her chest because, yeah, she liked that he laughed more too. Things were good, genuinely good in a way that felt fragile and precious, and then Lena's car broke down on a Tuesday morning in the middle of rush hour traffic, and everything almost fell apart. She'd managed to get the car towed to a mechanic who'd called her that afternoon with news that made her want to throw her phone across the room. The transmission was shot, and it would be $1,200 to fix. And Lena had sat in the bookstore break room staring at her bank account that showed $843 and trying not to have a panic attack. She called Connor without really thinking about it because he'd become the person she called when things went wrong. And when he picked up, she could hear the worry in his voice immediately. "Hey, what's up, you okay?" And Lena tried to keep her voice steady, but it came out shaky anyway. "My car died, transmission's gone, it's $1,200 to fix, and I don't have it. I don't know what to do." The silence on the other end of the phone was heavy and awful, and Lena could practically hear Connor's brain spinning through the same calculations she'd just done, wanting desperately to help and realizing he couldn't. And the weight of that silence said more than any words could have. "Lena, I'm so sorry. I wish I could. I don't have it either. I'm barely making rent this month." His voice was tight with frustration and shame, and Lena immediately tried to backtrack. "No, Connor, I wasn't asking you to pay for it. I just needed to vent. I'm sorry I shouldn't have called." But the damage was already done. She could hear it in the way he said, "I should go. I'll talk to you later," and hung up before she could say anything else. 3 days went by, and Connor's texts went from frequent to sporadic to non-existent. And when Lena checked her phone, she'd see that he'd read her messages but not responded. Would see those 3 dots appear like he was typing and then disappear. And she knew exactly what was happening because he'd warned her this might happen. The shame was eating him alive, and he was pulling away to protect himself from what he assumed was inevitable disappointment. She tried calling, and he didn't pick up. Tried suggesting they meet for coffee, and he said he was busy with work. And by day 5, Lena was done being patient because she'd told him she wasn't going anywhere, and she meant it. Saturday afternoon, she showed up at Connor's house unannounced, and when he opened the door looking surprised and guilty, she didn't give him a chance to make excuses. "We need to talk, and you don't get to avoid this conversation by ghosting me. Let me in." And Connor stepped back to let her pass. And they stood in his living room that had Evan's backpack on the couch and a stack of bills on the coffee table that he quickly tried to cover with a magazine. "Where's Evan?" Lena asked, and Connor said, "At a friend's house for a few hours." And Lena took that as permission to say what she'd been holding in for 5 days. "You don't get to decide I'm going to leave and walk away first." Lena's voice came out harder than she meant it to, but she was angry and hurt and needed him to hear this. "That's not protection, Connor. That's fear. That's you making the same choice your ex-wife made, except in reverse. She left when things got hard, and you're trying to leave before I can, and neither of those things is love." Connor's face went through about 6 different emotions, and he sat down on the couch like his legs couldn't hold him anymore. "I couldn't help you. You needed help, and I had nothing to give you. I felt like the most useless person on the planet." Lena sat down next to him, and her voice was softer now but still firm. I didn't need you to rescue me. I needed you to be here. I needed you to not disappear. The second things got complicated, I figured out the car myself. Payment plan with the mechanic, and I borrowed some money from my roommate from college. It's handled. But Connor, if every time something goes wrong, you're going to pull away like this, we're not going to make it. Connor put his head in his hands, and his shoulders shook slightly. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be in a relationship where I can't fix things, where I have to just sit with being helpless. And Lena put her hand on his back. Then we learned together, you let me help you the same way I'm letting you help me. This isn't about one person being the strong one. It's about both of us being honest about when we're struggling. They sat there on his couch with the afternoon light coming through the windows and the weight of 5 days of silence and fear between them. And finally, Connor lifted his head and looked at her with red eyes. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You're right. I got scared and I ran. And that's exactly what I said I wouldn't do. 2 weeks later, Connor started going to therapy at the community health clinic that had a sliding scale fee he could actually afford. And Lena watched him slowly start to untangle the shame and fear he'd been carrying around his worth and his ability to be loved despite his financial situation. It wasn't a quick fix. There were still moments when he'd retreat into himself, still times when she'd catch him staring at bills with that look of defeat. But he was trying, actually trying to let her in instead of pushing her away. One evening about a month after the car incident, Lena was at Connor's house helping make dinner while Evan did homework at the kitchen table, and she noticed the kid watching his dad with this serious expression. You used to look like that before Mom left, Evan said it casual while working on an algebra problem, and Connor looked up from chopping vegetables with confusion. Look like what? And Evan gestured vaguely at his father's face. All stressed and tired and like you were carrying something really heavy. You'd get that look on your face when you thought I wasn't watching. The kitchen went quiet and Lena saw Connor's hands still on the cutting board, and Evan kept talking in that brutally honest way teenagers have. You don't look like that when you're with Lena, or like you do sometimes, but it's different, like you're not carrying it alone anymore. Connor's eyes were wet when he looked at his son. When did you get so observant? And Evan shrugged. I'm 16, not blind, Dad. I notice stuff. A year after that confession in the bookstore, Connor and Lena had found a 2-bedroom apartment together because it was cheaper than maintaining 2 places. And they'd combined their limited resources and were building something that looked nothing like a fairy tale, but felt solid and real. Connor was still paying off debt, but he'd made a dent in it, still working 2 jobs, but with Lena helping with bills, it was slightly less crushing. And they'd both learned to be okay with a life that was simple and sometimes struggled financially, but was full of the things that actually mattered. The anniversary of Lena whispering, I think I'm falling for you, came around, and Connor had asked her to meet him at the bookstore after her shift, said he had something he wanted to talk about. And when she finished closing up, she found him sitting at their corner table by the window, the same spot where everything had started. You're being very mysterious, Lena said while sliding into the chair across from him, and Connor smiled that smile that Evan had noticed a year ago, the one that was different and real and reached his eyes. You whispered, I think I'm falling for you right at this table exactly 1 year ago, and I was absolutely terrified that when you knew the truth about my life you'd run. Connor took her hand across the table. And you gave me the truth that I'd been hiding from for years. That being broke doesn't make me unlovable. That vulnerability is strength, not weakness. And you stayed even when I tried to push you away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring. Nothing fancy or expensive, but clearly chosen with thought. I'm still in debt. I still work 2 jobs. I still can't give you expensive dates or fancy things. But I can give you honesty in all of me. Lena, will you marry me? Lena was crying before she could even answer. Yes, absolutely, yes. I don't want fancy things. I want you. I want us. I want this life we're building. And Connor slid the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, and they were both laughing and crying in the bookstore, where they'd fallen in love over coffee and books and brutal honesty. A few months later, they had a small wedding at the bookstore, with maybe 30 people, friends and family crammed between the shelves, and Evan stood next to his dad, looking proud in a suit jacket he'd borrowed from his uncle. During the reception, while Connor and Lena were swaying to music someone had put on a portable speaker, Evan was standing with Connor's brother talking about college plans, and his uncle asked him what he thought about his dad getting married. He still smiles like that when he talks to her, Evan said, watching his dad and Lena dance in the small space they'd cleared between tables. And there was a pause where he seemed to be choosing his words carefully, and then he added softer, just not sad anymore. Sometimes love isn't about having everything together, or being financially stable, or presenting some perfect version of yourself. Sometimes it's about whispering your truth in a bookstore and having someone whisper back that your truth is exactly what they choose. Connor and Lena built their life on honesty instead of fantasy, on staying through fear instead of running from it, on believing that being seen fully, debts and shame and struggles included, is the foundation of something real. If this story reminded you that you don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love, that vulnerability is the bridge to real connection, that the right person stays through the hard parts, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Thanks for being here with us. And remember, love isn't found in having it all together. It's found in letting someone see you fall apart and choosing to put yourselves back together as a team.